Hello, I'm Bill Such, basically facilitating this course, which is Dr. Painter's course, but he's on sabbatical. So I'm presuming you've listened to his comments, and now basically I just want to say a few words of introduction in what you're doing, which will be an intriguing and marvelous study in which you will seek to understand the gospel of Jesus perhaps in a different way, certainly a way that's more expansive than the way that Paul preaches about the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, because the four gospels are really put together from a spine, so to speak, which you will see that involves the crucifixion of Jesus, but also involves the ministry of Jesus. Generally speaking, Matthew's gospel was considered the first gospel for nearly 1900 years, primarily through Augustine, and you can see that in the shape of the canon when you begin with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Whereas from the mid-19th century, Mark's gospel has gained a lot of prominence in respect to being the first gospel that was written, certainly the shortest gospel, 16 chapters, over Luke's 24 and Matthew's 28 and John's 21. And consequently, the tightest form, so to speak, of the gospel is seen in Mark's gospel, which traditionally was sort of seen as a shorthand or a summary of Matthew's gospel, but it's now seen in its own right as a narrative that gave birth to the other two synoptic gospels. As you know, synoptic means Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are gospels who are very much alike, whereas John's gospel is quite different. One of the things that will be really good from this study is that you'll see the aperture, the nature in which the gospels are individual portraits of Jesus and have their own identities and therefore their own theologies. What we've done in the church tradition, especially, perhaps in view of not wanting to see any possible paradoxes or contradictions and so forth, is to operate out of a harmony of the gospel, so everything is sort of meshed together, but they're distinctly different. For example, one of the ways that you can really show this with people is to say, well, why is it that Mark's gospel does not begin with the birth of Jesus, as Matthew does and as Luke does, of course? Mark does not begin in that way whatsoever, but ignores the birth stories of Jesus. And John, of course, blows the whole thing wide open by taking the origins way back to Genesis 1 in the creation, in the beginning, and so forth. So you can see already from what I've just said that there's particular theologies of the Gospels, and if you come out of this course, by the end of it, you can identify the marks of what makes each Gospel unique. That will really help you in your preaching and your teaching. Essentially, the Gospels are organized around what I'd call a spine, which is really the ministry of Jesus and then the events that lead up to the death of Jesus and the resurrection. For example, in Mark's Gospel, in the first 8 chapters, you've got Jesus in the north, in Galilee, and then he starts to make a move in chapter 9 and chapter 10. He comes into Judea, and then from chapter 11 through chapter 16, he's solely in Jerusalem. And the events really from those chapters, which is approximately a third of Mark, are dealing with 5 or 6 days in respect to Jesus' life. So you can see from the start of that it's not a biography in the way that we would write a biography. It's very much written from the standpoint of communicating a tradition. And one of the difficulties scholars have got is to be able to try to separate the preaching of the gospel, the kerygma, from what's called the historical Jesus. And one of the great books on that is by Albert Schweitzer, the end of the 19th century, in which he showed the fallacy of trying to extricate or cut and paste the historical Jesus out of the Gospels from the standpoint of using what I'd call modern secular methods of how we understand ourselves as historical people in the academic field. Now, we're not doing it from that standpoint, although we look at it, we look at different ways in which the Gospels were understood. basically, if I can put it in terms of two forms, synchronic and diachronic. Synchronic means you read the gospel within itself and look for authorial intention in respect to the story form, so that you work out the perspective of the author by just following the narrative. Everything is self-contained from that standpoint. Whereas diachronic means Greek word dia, chronos, time, sequential time or chronological time. Therefore, what you do is you look through the gospel to see what is the historical circumstances that gave birth to these stories and how they were put together, and what do they say about the original community, Mark's community or Matthew's community, and what evidence can they give then as they're looking back a generation later. As you know, the Gospels were written somewhere between say 60, 65 and 85, 90 of the first century, so they're a generation after Jesus. They take up Paul's message of the gospel, which we can trace back in 1 Thessalonians and in Philippians, 1 Corinthians, way back to the early decades after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. But the Gospels then come later than that period and are much more expansive in the sense of bringing all these stories together and then putting them in a way that accentuates what? Well, one scholar referred to the Gospels as essentially a passion narrative with a long introduction. The focus is the resurrection, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. As I said that in Mark, you can see it in chapter 11 right through 16. In other words, at least a third of the gospel is concerned with just a few days. And although John's gospel is in many ways quite different from the synoptic gospels, it essentially follows that pattern in which Jesus has a ministry in Judea and in Galilee, and then ends up in Jerusalem, just like he does in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke. But having said that, John's Gospel is quite different in a number of ways. One scholar referred to the Synoptic Gospels as detailing the events of what Jesus did and what his teaching was, whereas John's Gospel is more what was in the mind of Jesus when he was doing his teachings. It's a much more, what would you say, intuitive or profound, or perhaps you could say even theological, because the notion of the Trinity that developed in the 4th and 5th centuries really essentially comes out of what John has actually said in his Gospel, in conjunction with other material in Paul and so forth. So one of the things then that will come out of this, I'm really hoping, is that you'll see the distinctive nature of each Gospel. It may be quite a surprise for you, in the sense that you will not come across this in church, is when you start looking at the two-stage hypotheses or the triple tradition in respect to if Mark was the first Gospel, then Luke and Matthew, what did they do when they took Mark's Gospel? It'd be really interesting to look and see how they used parts of Mark's Gospel. And then you look at the other material that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not found in Mark, the so-called Q document or Q source. Or alternatively, it could have been that Matthew used Mark and then Luke used Matthew. So then there isn't this Q material, but it's really a borrowing off each other, as well as the individual traditions that each have. It can get extremely complex and extremely speculative. But through it all, what you will see is that the identities of the evangelists are particular, are unique, so that you'll have the trepidation of when you move from one gospel to another, say for example in your preaching or your teaching, you'll have some reticence about that without first establishing what exactly is it that the author of this gospel says in respect to what the author of another gospel says. It'll give you some conundrums. For example, the sea-stilling story in Mark 4, where Jesus basically reprimands the disciples for not trusting in him when the storm comes up and he's asleep in the boat. And he looks at them and says, "Do you have no faith yet?" Whereas in Matthew's gospel, in the same story, Jesus says to them, "O ye of little faith." Now, what's interesting is that the notion of little faith comes across elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel. So that raises some interesting notions in respect to how Matthew then used the tradition that he'd got and what that tradition was to him in terms of the way that he constructed his tradition on the basis of his own perspective, as well as the taking the stories that he got from other sources. So this is just a dip in the water, so to speak, in respect to the gospel stories. And I think that you're going to find that this course has a profound impact on you personally, because what better way can you flesh open, so to speak, the theology of Paul in terms of the meaning of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 5, then going back and see the same thing, but this time in narrative form. And one of the tensions is what elements of doctrine come through that are picked up by Paul and so forth, but are seen in the most raw, so to speak, perspective of just being described of events that happened. So I'm looking forward to your contributions to this course. Thank you.